Chapter 20. Sand. I shall show the cinders of my spirits through the ashes of my chance. Shakespeare. Perseverance is a virtue that wins each godlike act, and plucks success even from the spear-proofed crest of rugged danger. William Harvard. Never say fail again. Richelieu. It is the one neck nearer that wins the race and shows the blood, the one pull more of the oar that proves the beefiness of the fellow, as Oxford men say. It is the one march more that wins the campaign, the 5 minutes more persistent courage that wins the fight. Though your force be less than another's, you equal and outmaster your opponent if you continue it longer and concentrate it more. Smiles. I know no such unquestionable badge and ensign of a sovereign mind as that tenacity of purpose which through all changes of companions or parties or fortunes changes never, bates no jot of heart or hope, but wearies out opposition and arrives at its port. "Well done, Tommy Brooks!" exclaimed his teacher in pleased surprise, when the dunce of the school spoke his piece without omitting a single word. The other boys had laughed when he rose, for they expected a bad failure. But when the rest of the class had tried, the teacher said Tommy had done the best of all, and gave him the prize. "And now tell me," said she, "how you learned the poem so well." "Please, ma'am, it was the snail on the wall that taught me how to do it," said Tommy. At this the other pupils laughed aloud, but the teacher said, "You need not laugh, boys, for we may learn much from such things as snails. How did the snail teach you, Tommy?" "I saw it crawl up the wall, little by little," replied the boy. "It did not stop nor turn back, but went on, and I thought I would do the same with the poem. So I learned it little by little, and did not give up. By the time the snail reached the top of the wall, I had learned the whole poem." I may here impart the secret of what is called good and bad luck, said Addison. There are men who, supposing Providence to have an implacable spite against them, bemoan in the poverty of old age the misfortunes of their lives. Luck forever runs against them and for others. One with a good profession lost his luck in the river, where he idled away his time a-fishing. Another with a good trade perpetually burnt up his luck by his hot temper, which provoked all his employees to leave him. Another with a lucrative business lost his luck by amazing diligence at everything but his own business. Another who steadily followed his trade, as steadily followed the bottle. Another who was honest and constant to his work, erred by his perpetual misjudgment. He lacked discretion. Hundreds lose their luck by indulging sanguine expectations, by trusting fraudulent men, and by dishonest gains. A man never has good luck who has a bad wife. I never knew an early-rising, hard-working, prudent man, careful of his earnings and strictly honest, who complained of his bad luck. A good character, good habits, and iron industry are impregnable to the assaults of the ill luck that fools are dreaming of. But when I see a tatterdemalion creeping out of a grocery late in the forenoon, with his hands stuck into his pockets, the rim of his hat turned up and the crown knocked in, I know he has had bad luck, for the worst of all luck is to be a sluggard, a knave, or a tippler. "You have a difficult subject," said Anthony Trollope at Niagara Falls to an artist who had attempted to draw the spray of the waters. "All subjects are difficult," was the reply, "to a man who desires to do well." "But yours, I fear, is impossible," said Trollope. "You have no right to say so, till I have finished my picture," protested the artist. "Tell Louisa to stick to her teaching. She can never succeed as a writer." When her father delivered the rejected manuscript of a story sent to James T. Fields, editor of the Atlantic Monthly, with the above message, Miss Alcott said, "Tell him I will succeed as a writer, and some day I shall write for the Atlantic." Not long after, she sent an article to the Atlantic and received a check for $50. With the money, she said, she bought a second-hand carpet for the parlor, a bonnet for her sister, shoes and stockings for herself. Her father was calling upon Longfellow some time after this, when Longfellow took the Atlantic and said, "I want to read to you Emerson's fine poem upon Thoreau's flute." Mr. Alcott interrupted him with delight, and said, "My daughter Louisa wrote that." "Men talk as if victory were something fortunate," says Emerson. "Work is victory. Wherever work is done, victory is obtained. There is no chance and no blanks. You want but one verdict. If you have your own, you are secure of the rest. But if witnesses are wanted, witnesses are near." "Young gentlemen," says Francis Wayland, "remember that nothing can stand day's work." Alexander the Great exclaimed to his soldiers, disaffected after a long campaign, "Go home, and tell them that you left Alexander to conquer the world alone." "We discount only our own bills, and not those of private persons," said the cashier of the Bank of England, when a large bill was drawn by Anselm Rothschild of Frankfort on Nathan Rothschild of London. "Private persons!" exclaimed Nathan, when told of the cashier's remark. "I will make these gentlemen see what sort of private persons we are." 3 weeks later he presented a £5 note at the bank at the opening of the office. The teller counted out 5 sovereigns, looking surprised that Baron Rothschild should have troubled himself about such a trifle. The Baron examined the coins one by one, weighing them in the balance, as he said the law gave him the right to do, put them into a little canvas bag, and offered a second, and then a third, fourth, 50th, 1000th note. When a bag was full, he handed it to a clerk in waiting, and proceeded to fill another. In 7 hours he had changed £21,000, and with 9 employees of his house similarly engaged, had occupied the tellers so busily in changing $1,050,000 worth of notes that no one else could receive attention. The bankers laughed, but the next morning Rothschild appeared with his 9 clerks and several drays to carry away the gold, remarking, "These gentlemen refuse to pay my bills. I have sworn not to keep theirs. They can pay at their leisure, only I notify them that I have enough to employ them for 2 months." The smiles faded from the features of the bank officials as they thought of a draft of $55 million in gold, which they did not hold. Next morning notice was given in the newspapers that the Bank of England would pay Rothschild's bills as well as its own. "Well," said Barnum to a friend in 1841, "I am going to buy the American Museum." "Buy it!" exclaimed the astonished friend, who knew that the showman had not a dollar. "What do you intend buying it with?" "Brass," was the prompt reply, "for silver and gold have I none." Everyone interested in public entertainments in New York knew Barnum, and knew the condition of his pocket. But Francis Olmsted, who owned the museum building, consulted numerous references, all telling of, quote, "a good showman who would do as he agreed," unquote, and accepted a proposition to give security for the purchaser. Mr. Olmsted was to appoint a money-taker at the door, and credit Barnum toward the purchase with all above expenses, and an allowance of $50 per month to support his wife and 3 children. Mrs. Barnum gladly assented to the arrangement, and offered, if need be, to cut down the household expenses to a little more than $1 a day. Some 6 months later Mr. Olmsted happened to enter the ticket office at noon, and found Barnum eating for dinner a few slices of bread and some corned beef. "Is this the way you eat your dinner?" he asked. "I have not eaten a warm dinner since I bought the museum, except on the Sabbath, and I intend never to eat another until I get out of debt." "Ah, you are safe, and will pay for the museum before the year is out," said Mr. Olmsted, slapping the young man approvingly on the shoulder. He was right, for in less than a year Barnum had paid every cent out of the profits of the establishment. A noted philosopher said, "The favors of fortune are like steep rocks. Only eagles and creeping things mount to the summit." Lord Campbell, who became Chief Justice and Lord Chancellor of England, and amassed a large fortune, began life as a drudge in a printing office. A little observation shows us that, as a rule, the men who accomplish the most in the world are the most useful and sensible members of society, the men who are depended upon most in emergencies, the men of backbone and stamina, the bone and sinew of their communities, the men who can always be relied upon, who are healthiest and happiest, are, as a rule, of ordinary mental caliber and medium capacity, but with persistent and untiring industry, these are they, after all, who carry the burdens and reap the prizes of life. It is the men and women who keep everlastingly at it, who do not believe themselves geniuses, but who know that if they ever accomplish anything great, they must do it by common drudgery and persistent industry, and with an unwavering aim in one pursuit. Those who believe themselves geniuses are apt to scatter their efforts and thus fritter away their great energies without accomplishing anything in proportion to their high promise. Often the men who promise the most pay the least. Mrs. Frank Leslie often refers to the time she lived in her carpetless attic while striving to pay her husband's obligations. She has fought her way successfully through 9 lawsuits and has paid the entire debt. She manages her 10 publications entirely herself, signs all checks and money orders, makes all contracts, looks over all proofs, and approves the make-up of everything before it goes to press. She has developed great business ability, which no one dreamed she possessed. A little boy was asked how he learned to skate. "Oh, by getting up every time I fell down," he replied. The boy Thorwaldsen, whose father died in the poorhouse, and whose education was so scanty that he had to write his letters over many times before they could be posted, by his indomitable perseverance, tenacity, and grit, fascinated the world with the genius which neither his discouraging father, poverty, nor hardship could repress. "It is all very well," said Charles J. Fox, "to tell me that a young man has distinguished himself by a brilliant first speech. He may go on, or he may be satisfied with his first triumph. But show me a man who has not succeeded at first, and nevertheless has gone on, and I will back that young man to do better than most of those who have succeeded at the first trial." It was the last 3 days of the first voyage of Columbus that told. All his years of struggle and study would have availed nothing if he had yielded to the mutiny. It was all in those 3 days. But what days! Often defeated in battle, said Macaulay of Alexander the Great, he was always successful in war. He might have said the same of Washington, and, with appropriate changes, of all who win great triumphs of any kind. One of the greatest preachers of modern times, Lacordaire, failed again and again. Everybody said he would never make a preacher, but he was determined to succeed, and in 2 years from his humiliating failures he was preaching in Notre Dame to immense congregations. Orange Judd was a remarkable example of success through grit. He earned corn by working for farmers, carried it on his back to mill, brought back the meal to his room, cooked it himself, milked cows for his pint of milk per day, and lived on mush and milk for months together. He worked his way through Wesleyan University, and took a 3 years postgraduate course at Yale. Oh, the triumphs of this indomitable spirit of the conqueror! This it was that enabled Franklin to dine on a small loaf in the printing office with a book in his hand. It helped Locke to live on bread and water in a Dutch garret. It enabled Gideon Lee to go barefoot in the snow, half-starved and thinly clad. It sustained Lincoln and Garfield on their hard journeys from the log cabin to the White House. The very reputation of being strong-willed, plucky, and indefatigable is of priceless value. It often cows enemies, and dispels at the start opposition to one's undertakings which would otherwise be formidable. When you get into a tight place and everything goes against you, till it seems as if you could not hold on a minute longer, said Harriet Beecher Stowe, never give up then, for that's just the place and time that the tide'll turn. Never despair, says Burke, but if you do, work on in despair. Once, when Marshal Ney was going into battle, looking down at his knees which were smiting together, he said, "You may well shake. You would shake worse yet if you knew where I am going to take you." "Go it, William," an old boxer was overheard saying to himself in the midst of a fight. At him again. Never say die. A striking incident is related of the early experience of George Law, who in his day was one of the most conspicuous financiers and capitalists of New York City. When he was a young man, he went to New York, poor and friendless. One day he was walking along the streets, hungry, not knowing where his next meal would come from, and passed a new building in course of erection. Through some accident one of the hod carriers fell from the structure and dropped dead at his feet. Young Law, in his desperation, applied for the job to take the dead man's place, and the place was given him. He went to work, and this was how one of the wealthiest and shrewdest New York businessmen got his start. See young Disraeli, sprung from a hated and persecuted race, without opportunity, pushing his way up through the middle classes, up through the upper classes, until he stands self-poised upon the topmost round of political and social power. Scoffed, ridiculed, rebuffed, hissed from the House of Commons, he simply says, "The time will come when you will hear me." The time did come, and the boy with no chance swayed the scepter of England for a quarter of a century. If impossibilities ever exist, popularly speaking, they ought to have been found somewhere between the birth and the death of Kitto, that deaf pauper and master of Oriental learning. But Kitto did not find them there. In the presence of his decision and imperial energy they melted away. Kitto begged his father to take him out of the poorhouse, even if he had to subsist like the Hottentots. He told him that he would sell his books and pawn his handkerchief, by which he thought he could raise about 12 shillings. he said he could live upon blackberries, nuts, and field turnips, and was willing to sleep on a hayrick. Here was real grit. What were impossibilities to such a resolute will? Patrick Henry voiced that decision which characterized the great men of the Revolution when he said, "Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Look at Garrison reading this advertisement in a Southern paper. $5,000 will be paid for the head of W.L. Garrison by the governor of Georgia. Behold him again. A broadcloth mob is leading him through the streets of Boston by a rope. He is hurried to jail. See him return calmly and unflinchingly to his work, beginning at the point at which he was interrupted. Note this heading in The Liberator, the type of which he set himself in an attic on State Street in Boston. "I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch. And I will be heard." Was Garrison heard? Ask a race set free largely by his efforts. Even the gallows erected in front of his own door did not daunt him. He held the ear of an unwilling world with that burning word, freedom, which was destined never to cease its vibrations until it had breathed its sweet secret to the last slave. At a time when abolitionists were dangerously unpopular, a crowd of brawny Cape Cod fishermen had made such riotous demonstrations that all the speakers announced, except Stephen Foster and Lucy Stone, had fled from an open-air platform. "You had better run, Stephen," said she. "They are coming." "But who will take care of you?" asked Foster. "This gentleman will take care of me," she replied, calmly laying her hand within the arm of a burly rioter with a club, who had just sprung upon the platform. "What did you say?" stammered the astonished rowdy, as he looked at the little woman. "Yes, I'll take care of you, and no one shall touch a hair of your head." With this, he forced a way for her through the crowd, and, at her earnest request, placed her upon a stump, and stood guard with his club while she delivered an address so effective that the audience offered no further violence, and even took up a collection of $20 to repay Mr. Foster for the damage his clothes had received when the riot was at its height. "Luck is ever waiting for something to turn up," says Cobden. "Labor, with keen eyes and strong will turn up something. Luck lies in bed and wishes the postman would bring him the news of a legacy. Labor turns out at 6 o'clock, and with busy pen or ringing hammer lays the foundation of a competence. Luck whines. Labor whistles. Luck relies on chance. Labor on character. There is no luck, for all practical purposes, to him who is not striving, and whose senses are not all eagerly attent. What are called accidental discoveries are almost invariably made by those who are looking for something. A man incurs about as much risk of being struck by lightning as by accidental luck. There is perhaps an element of luck in the amount of success which crowns the efforts of different men, but even here it will usually be found that the sagacity with which the efforts are directed, and the energy with which they are prosecuted, measure pretty accurately the luck contained in the results achieved. Apparent exceptions will be found to relate almost wholly to single undertakings, while in the long run the rule will hold good. Two pearl divers, equally expert, dive together and work with equal energy. One brings up a pearl, while the other returns empty-handed. but let both persevere, and at the end of 5, 10, or 20 years, it will be found that they succeeded almost in exact proportion to their skill and industry. Lincoln, being asked by an anxious visitor what he would do after 3 or 4 years if the rebellion was not subdued, replied, "Oh, there is no alternative but to keep pegging away." "It is in me, and it shall come out," said Sheridan, when told that he would never make an orator, as he had failed in his first speech in Parliament. He became known as one of the foremost orators of his day. It takes great courage to fight a lost cause when there is no hope even of victory. To contest every inch of ground with as much persistency and enthusiasm as if we were assured of victory, this is true courage. The world admires the man who never flinches from unexpected difficulties, who calmly, patiently, and courageously grapples with his fate, who dies, if need be, at his post. President Chadbourne put grit in place of his lost lung, and worked 35 years after his funeral had been planned. Henry Fawcett put grit in place of eyesight, and became the greatest Postmaster General England ever had. Prescott also put grit in place of eyesight, and became one of America's greatest historians. Francis Parkman put grit in place of health and eyesight, and became the greatest historian of America in his line. Thousands of men have put grit in place of health, eyes, ears, hands, legs, and yet have achieved marvelous success. Indeed, most of the great things of the world have been accomplished by grit and pluck. You cannot keep a man down who has these qualities. He will make stepping stones out of his stumbling blocks, and lift himself to success. Grit and pluck are not always exhibited only by poor boys who have no chance, for there are many notable examples of pluck, persistence, and real grit among youth in good circumstances, who never have to fight their way to their own loaf. Mr. Mifflin, who has recently become the head of the celebrated publishing firm of Houghton, Mifflin and Company, is a notable example of persistency, push, and grit. After graduating at Harvard and traveling abroad, he was determined, although not obliged, to work for a living, to get a position at the Riverside Press in Cambridge. He called upon the late Mr. Houghton and asked him for a situation. Mr. Houghton told him that he had no opening, and that even if he had, he did not believe that a graduate from Harvard, who had money and who had traveled abroad, would ever be willing to begin at the bottom and do the necessary drudgery for boy's pay. Mr. Mifflin protested that he was not afraid of hard work, and that he was willing to do anything and take any sort of a position if he could only learn the business. But Mr. Houghton would not give him any encouragement. Again and again Mr. Mifflin came to the Riverside Press and pressed his suit, but to no purpose. Mr. Mifflin persuaded his father to intercede for him, but Mr. Houghton succeeded in convincing him that it would be very unwise for his son to attempt it. But young Mifflin was determined not to give up. Finally Mr. Houghton, out of admiration for his persistence and pluck, made a place for him, which had been occupied by a boy, for $5 a week. Young Mifflin took hold of the work with such earnestness, and showed so much pluck and determination, that Mr. Houghton soon called him into the office and raised his pay to $9 a week from the time he began. Although the young man lived in Boston, he was always at the Riverside Press in Cambridge early in the morning, and would frequently remain after all the others had gone. Mr. Houghton happened to go in late one night, after everybody had gone, as he supposed, and was surprised to find Mr. Mifflin there, taking one of the presses apart. Of course such a young man would be advanced. These are the boys who become the heads of firms. It is victory after victory with the soldier, lesson after lesson with the scholar, blow after blow with the laborer, crop after crop with the farmer, picture after picture with the painter, and mile after mile with the traveler, that secures what all so much desire, success. Stick to the thing and carry it through. Believe you were made for the place you fill, and that no one else can fill it as well. Put forth your whole energies. Be awake, electrify yourself, go forth to the task. Only once learn to carry a thing through in all its completeness and proportion, and you will become a hero. You will think better of yourself. Others will think better of you. The world in its very heart admires the stern, determined doer.